The idea of evil, god of the abyss, the ungodly god born of man. Whether you think it's canon or not, the idea of evil is certainly one of the most fascinating characters in Berserk. For those who are unaware of what on earth I'm talking about, the idea of evil is a being who appears in only 2 chapters of the manga, Chapter 82 and the Lost Chapter. It's only present in the last frame of Chapter 82, shortly after Griffith decides to sacrifice his comrades. As he starts sinking through the astral realm, about to begin his transformation, Griffith spots a large being, and the chapter ends with Griffith addressing it, only in question as God? Where we really get to know the idea is in Chapter 83, the so-called Lost Chapter. After writing it, Miura requested the chapter not be published in the Japanese or English translation because it revealed too much of the story too soon, and it might restrict what he was able to do in future chapters. So it's in a weird state of canonicity. The idea of evil might be canon, just not yet, or Miura might have scrapped the idea entirely. Either way, it's an interesting chapter and well worth the read. I'll leave a link to a translation of it in the doobly-doo. In this chapter, we're introduced to the idea of evil, the self-proclaimed desired god. He explains to Griffith that he was created out of a human need for reason. People wanted reasons for the destiny that kept transcending their knowledge. It also explains that a part of it resides within every human. Quote, a common consciousness that transcends individuality. Their collective consciousness is a species. I was born from these swells as the ego of this world. I am the darkness that dwells in every human heart. Unquote. A fascinating idea, isn't it? Not only the idea that it was humans who created God, not vice versa, but that God isn't a being in the sky, but rather an idea that dwells within all of us. So what philosophical theory or theories is this idea of God based off of? If you go on the fandom Wikipedia page for the idea of evil, it actually says, quote, the idea of evil is an evil version of Plato's theory of forms, unquote. So what is Plato's theory of forms? For those who weren't forced to memorize it in middle school, the theory of forms is Plato's idea that non-physical forms represent the most accurate reality. Take a cup, for example. Whether this cup is blue or red, has a handle or doesn't, we still recognize it as a cup. It has a certain cuppiness about it. And that's because, to Plato, all cups are imperfect copies of the perfect form of a cup. Think about it. Every cup is different, but if we were to analyze them, we could figure out what elements are necessary to make a cup a cup. If we look at the essence of a cup long enough, we could eventually come to a definition of what a cup is. We could create a mental image of what a perfect cup would be. But does that perfect cup exist in our world? Of course not. Plato thought that that perfect cup, what he calls the form of a cup, resides in a world separate from our own, what he called the world of forms. Everything we have in our world, objects like cups and swords, but also concepts like beauty and justice, are just imperfect copies of their form that exists outside of our reality. It's an interesting theory in itself, but I don't think that's what's playing out in this chapter of Berserk. By this theory, the idea of evil would probably be the form of evilness in our world. And that kind of makes sense, since part of him resides in the heart of every human. But the theory of forms doesn't make sense with the idea that the desired god was created by humans. Plato certainly didn't think that we invented the forms. The only way we could even interact with them was through reason and rational thinking. And it's not as though evil and misery didn't exist before this god was created. On the contrary, he was born because humans desired reasons to explain the evilness in their world. So I think we can say a solid no to the idea of evil being an evil version of Plato's theory of forms. So what philosophical theories are at work in this chapter? To determine that, we need to go back to the time of the pre-Socratics and talk about the laughing philosopher himself, Democritus. Though he's most well known for his atomic theory, which we touched on briefly in the Steins Gate episode, he is also considered to be one of the first documented atheists. Democritus did not believe in a god, at least a god as we understand it. He believed that humans created God as a way to explain the things that they couldn't understand. Things like earthquakes and hurricanes, but also death and suffering. Since they couldn't understand these things themselves, they explained them by reference to superhuman agency. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's the same reason that drove the humans in Berserk to create the idea of evil. But Democritus is making reference towards the being that we imagine to be God. In Berserk, the idea of evil is just that, an idea, not a physical being, at least one that exists in our reality. So where did that concept originate? Let's talk about Hegel. And yes, I had to reread Hegel for this episode, and if that doesn't earn your subscription, I don't know what will. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a 19th century thinker who is most well known for his influence on the philosophy of Karl Marx. And yes, if you didn't get the joke earlier, he's famous for being inscrutable in his writing. Many just assume that he was an atheist, like his pupil Marx, but that isn't the case. Hegel begins with a critique of the ordinary way we think about God. If I were to ask you what came to mind when I said the word God just then, you would probably say some sort of omniscient and omnipotent being, right? But if that's indeed what you imagined, Hegel would say that there's a huge assumption you're making there. You're assuming that God is a being at all. To Hegel, God cannot be a being in this world where we describe ourselves as beings, because that would mean that God is inherently limited in some way. To quote one of the articles I left below for further reading, quote, "If God is truly to be infinite, truly unlimited, then God cannot be a being, because a being, that is one being among others, is already limited by its relation to others." End quote. In other words, God cannot be infinite if he exists as a being among other beings. So then what does Hegel believe God is? Hegel thought that God was just the process of self-determination, the fullest form of reality. Now what on earth does that mean? Hegel had a lot to say on the subject of freedom. He believed that your actions aren't completely free unless you understand why you are taking them. And when you come to realize a way that your actions are controlled not by yourself, but by the stuff around you, Hegel would say that you are more real in that moment than you were before. A being acting independently of its own fruition is more real than one constantly dependent on something else. And Hegel thought that process of self-determination, the power to make a decision for oneself without influence from the outside, was God. And if, like Hegel believes, self-determination does lead to a greater reality, then wouldn't God be the greatest form of reality? It's a thought-provoking idea, but how does it relate to Berserk? The desired God manifests itself in the human world as the concepts of causality and evil, similar to how Hegel's God manifests itself in the concept of self-determination. The idea of evil also resides within every human, the same way the power of self-determination resides within all of us. Now, I'm obviously not here saying that this was exactly what Miura had in mind when he wrote this chapter. This is just a way of exploring the origins of these ideas with some historical context. But we already know that philosophy has a large impact on Miura's writing. Griffith's speech on what makes someone a friend is right out of Friedrich Nietzsche. In fact, Nietzsche's ideas are all over Berserk. I could probably make a video just talking about that. But we can't be certain on what this story is trying to say until we reach the ending. That is, if we even get an ending. So, what do you think? Is the idea of evil canon? What philosophical theories are the idea of evil based on? Do you think I'm totally wrong? That's fine, this is just my opinion, mate. I've been restraining myself from making a Berserk video for a while now, but I think it's about the right time, what with another hiatus on the horizon. And right after we got Casca back, come on Miura! If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe or check out my last video on the supporting cast of Violet Evergarden. As always, if you'd like to know more about the philosophy discussed in this video, I've left some links and reading recommendations in the doobly-doo. Like, share, and all that jazz, and I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye!